Welcome to our next author, Florin Leonte. But first, I think we need to start with a thank you to Petros Bouras-Vallianatos, our organizer. Now, sadly, a former colleague here at Edinburgh. So we're all very grateful indeed that he has accepted honorary membership of our School of History, Classics and Archaeology, and tremendously grateful for the time Petros has invested into organizing the second Edinburgh Book Festival to bring us all together again to discuss recent publications in the field. My name is Niels Gaul, as I said, a former colleague now, and now honorary colleague of Petros's, one of the Byzantinists at Edinburgh, and it is my pleasure to chair and introduce this section on Florin Leonte's most recent second book, Ethos, Logos and Perspective, Studies in Late Byzantine Rhetoric. And welcome, Florin. I've been very excited to be asked to chair this book because the topic of it is so close to things I've been working on lately and have these past days been terrorizing audiences in Oxford and online with, which is the concept of ethos in Byzantine rhetoric. And I think we all need to be very grateful for Florin to having tackled this important topic in such detail for the last 100 years of Byzantine rhetorical production, as it were, and in the process, Florin's also really become sort of the port-parole for these authors at the tail end of Byzantine literature, which otherwise would probably be falling off. A few words on Florin before I continue, who's probably the only author, Petros will correct me if I'm wrong, he's probably the only author present as an author in both book festivals. 2 years ago, Margaret Mullet introduced Florin's first book on imperial visions of late Byzantium, and now we have his second book, Ethos, Logos and Perspective, Studies in Late oh yes, of course, how could I forget, of course, along with Sophia Xenophontos, who's equally productive in terms of ethical commentaries and the role of, or the revival of ethical philosophy in Byzantium. Yeah, thank you, Petros, and apologies. So, and I think Florin has really given us here a wonderful examples, also continues neatly from what we've discussed with Baukier's book just now, continues neatly from that, and has given us a wonderful analysis of ethos and the various levels and roles it works in Byzantine rhetoric, drawing examples from the late period, but no doubt with ramifications and repercussions far beyond for all of Byzantine literature, and no doubt, given the late period, into adjacent fields, Latin rhetoric, in which Florin works as well. And I think what makes this such a wonderful book to have is the close attention you pay to how ethos works out in the text. You rightly deal with these two levels of ethos, the one in the text and the one under the text. And I think you bring this together very beautifully in your contemplative ethos on the one hand, and the dynamic ethos on the other. The categories you introduce, each subdivided into further categories. The contemplative ethos mediating between the object and the audience, and the dynamic ethos, allowing the author to bring himself into the text and push for action, push matters forward, as it were. I think that is very well analyzed and done. And then you split this further into an impersonal and personal perspective in the text, also explaining the third term in the title, how these two aspects of ethos come together with perspective to allow the author to make a cohesive argument. And then I think the second important contribution in terms of underlying theory is then your analysis of logos that follows suit, as it were. again drawing, as in the first chapter, on both ancient and contemporary rhetorical theory, analyzing how the various features coming into late Byzantine epidectic rhetoric, elusiveness, amplification, imagery, break-offs, come together with ethos to make the argument, and you then elucidate all this into case studies. First, John VIII, the Isidore encomium for John VIII's Polylogos, on which you've also worked previously, and finally, Joseph Brianeus' 49 chapters. And I think it's a good moment to pass on to you for further information on the book, and then come back for the discussion.
Well, thank you. I hope you can hear and see me. Can you hear me? And can you see me? I will have a PowerPoint presentation as well. Let me share the screen. Okay, I hope you can see my presentation. Thank you, Niels, for this brief presentation, and thank you, Petros, for this event, which has proved to be wonderful so far. So this book came from an attempt to address the difficulties in approaching texts of praise. As many scholars have long recognized, these texts of praise are numerous and heterogeneous. Their rhetoric is full of standard imagery. Their wording is often obscure. Also, contextual details elude us. However, I think that we should emphasize that their exceptional features rather than deplore their difficulties. The texts of praise from this period present a unique blend of characteristics. On the one hand, in many cases, the authors construct an imaginative world full of metaphors, rhetorical play, and digressions. On the other hand, these texts offer a view into many facets of contemporary Byzantine society. Emperors in search for political support, land disputes, sometimes disrespectful play between old friends, and much more. So the corpus of sources that I considered covers the last 100 years of Byzantine history. While I tried to look at most manifestations of court praise, I addressed only a sample of illustrative laudatory speeches with a diverse range of forms and topics. I dealt with the epidectic works of the most representative authors active in that time frame, so from 1350s to 1450s. So from Dimitrios Kydonis to John Dokianos or John Argyropoulos. So despite the differences in approaches, their careers and oeuvres display common features. Their close connections with the imperial families, like the Cantacuzini, the Paleologi in Constantinople, or the Comneni in Trebizond, the frequent instances of textual influences, inter-influences, and the common scholarly interests attested by their manuscript or epistolary exchanges. All these confirm the existence of a vibrant community of rhetoricians. So since praise was not limited to a particular genre, one problem is to find which texts belong to the broad category of rhetorical praise. With regard to the late Byzantine period, these multiple occurrences can be systematically noted in three categories of writings: orations addressed to members of ruling families or aristocratic families, ekphrases, descriptions of cities or buildings, occasional letters, and funeral texts. These categories of texts, together with their subtypes, were either performed at important occasions like imperial returns from a campaign and on the spot as brief public reminders of imperial plans. Furthermore, it was common that acts of praise were not limited to single compositions, but were developed across a series of public addresses from a single author. For instance, John Dokianos addressed two prosphonematia and an encomium to Emperor Constantine XI around 1450s. A century before him, Dimitrios Kydonis in the around the 1370s, addressed several successive orations to Emperor John V. Late Byzantine praise must therefore be understood as a process that involved long-term calculated strategies of public address with multiple stages. Despite the ubiquity of rhetorical praise, research has shown that it is difficult to pin down its observations, effectiveness, or changing forms. Taking cues from several strands of modern rhetorical criticism, my main argument in this book is that the late Byzantine epideictic texts, although displaying many standard themes of praise, generated a tension between two perspectives that authors sought to combine. One that cultivated ideals and models, especially from the past traditions, and another that looked at reality and tried to change it. This tension that echoes an increased emphasis on reality and pragmatic action can be perceived in how authors used and configured the proofs of epideictic rhetoric, in particular ethos, a speaker's character in relation to audience, and logos, or elocution. These concepts, ethos and logos, have long been discussed ever since the dawn of rhetoric. Subsequent scholars redefined, modern scholars redefined ethos and extended its meaning to the notion of a dynamically constructed persona underpinned by the changing attitudes of the speaker and the message of the text. In a similar vein, logos was initially defined in classical rhetorical scholarship as the arrangement and distribution of a set of fixed themes and stylistic devices. Yet arguably, in the period under investigation here, so 1350s to 1450s, this configuration was shaped by deeper concerns with other issues like the empire's center and periphery, so defining the center and periphery of the empire, its past, present, and future, as well as its moral and political reform. So several key questions guide this book. Primarily, I consider how authors delineated their intentions by shifting their personas according to the intended messages, and how argumentation was developed with the help of rhetorical devices and themes. The answers to these initial questions open a path to considering the workings of praise into specific texts, where I ask more focused questions about the function of praise in the historical, social, and cultural context of late Byzantium. Which higher authorities did authors invoke in their praise? How did praise function in a deterritorialized empire like the late Byzantine one? Or how did praise shape other purposes like giving moral advice? Chapter 1 examines ethos and the differences in its forms, which emerged from the tensions between two distinct textual frameworks. On the one hand, a personal and subjective point of view. So authors spoke a lot in first person. But on the other hand, we have an impersonal collective point of view that aimed at ensuring objectiveness in praise. The combinations of personal and impersonal perspectives generated two main types of ethos, which Niels spoke about. A static one, which privileged contemplation of the object of praise, be it a human, a building, or a city, and a dynamic kind of ethos whereby authors enacted calls for public action. Chapter 2, which deals with another facet of court praise, that is logos, contends that the late Byzantine eulogies are shifting between two kinds of response to the object of praise. Idealism and pragmatism. Both approaches are correlated to the two types of ethos previously discussed, static, contemplative, and dynamic. They hold several major features. Idealism is largely descriptive and oriented to the past, while pragmatism deals with proximity. It's oriented to the future and uses a straightforward kind of expression. Since the juxtaposition of these two responses to the object of praise was far from smooth, late Byzantine texts came to encapsulate a tension between a temptation to immerse completely in an imagined model world, and the need to address real concerns. This tension appears on three levels: form and use of rhetorical devices like metaphors or analogies, for instance, content and themes, and the typology of arguments. So to this end, I first trace the orator's figures of speech, metaphors, comparisons, analogies, epithets, and so on. In the ensuing part, I bring out the attitudes the epidatic texts take toward time, space, and political ideas that unveil the deeper concerns of late Byzantine epidatic. Lastly, I turn to the kinds of arguments used by late Byzantine rhetoricians, dialogic and concerning causes and effects. In the following two chapters, I try to apply these perspectives outlined in the previous sections, and I present two case studies. So chapter 3 explores the spatial thinking and correlative rhetorical design embedded in a panegyric penned by Cardinal Isidore. So this was written in 1429. His extensive encomium for John VIII, Byzantine emperor between 1425 and 1448, devotes much of its content to the description of spaces, in particular the urban area of Constantinople, the provinces of the Peloponnese, and the continental Greece. I argue that space represents here a core component of the author's strategy to mediate between the necessity to praise and the intention to construct discursively a reality that reflects the challenges of a dwindling state. The final chapters moves the focus beyond praise and looks at evidence outside works of epidatic rhetoric by examining a didactic composition written by a court preacher, Joseph Vrienios. It is a text of advice divided into chapters, into small moral chapters. Here I show how the pervasiveness of epidatic figurative language and extended vivid analogies shaped his specific kind of teaching and unveiled the author's acquaintance with the technique of rhetorical amplification, which was primarily used in contemporary laudatory speeches. So to conclude, as it is always the case in history, the story of late Byzantine praise is a story of continuity and change. There are certainly many continuities, but there is also an overarching change. That is the introduction of a new perspective that answered to an increased sense of urgency and anxiety present in the decades before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And with this, I finished. Thank you very much.